Hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. I know many of you have your minds on the escalating conflict in the region, and as we continue our coverage of current events here at AGSI, we also remain engaged in investigating long-term trends that affect societal changes in the region, in the Gulf region. And we are pleased to bring you this conversation today around a new publication titled Saudi Youth Policies and Practice that seeks to understand and explain the nuances surrounding the formation and implementation of youth policy in today's Saudi Arabia. And we're delighted to have the publication's editors along with one of the chapter authors with us. I'll introduce them very briefly here and share a link to their full bios in the chat. I'll start first with Mark Thompson, Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Socioeconomics Program at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh. Previously, he was the Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies at the King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals. He has lived and worked in Saudi Arabia since 2001 for diverse institutions, and his books include Saudi Arabia and the Path to Political Change, National Dialogue and Civil Society, and Being Young, Male and Saudi, Identity and Politics in a Globalized Kingdom. I'm also happy to welcome back Neil Quilliam, Energy Research Director at SRMG Think, and Associate Fellow at Chatham House. He is an energy policy, geopolitics, and foreign affairs specialist and a director at Azure Strategy Consulting. Previously, he was the acting head of the MENA program at Chatham House and has also served as a senior MENA energy advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and senior MENA analyst at Control Risks. Last but not least is Noreen Mandora. She is a PhD candidate in the International Development Department at King's College London. Previously, she was a behavioral public policy consultant at Hawaz, a consulting firm specialized in providing public policy and behavioral science consultancy in the Saudi governmental sector. Her current research is on how gender relations have changed across multiple generations in Saudi Arabia around female employment and education. And moderating the session today is my colleague Kristin Diwan. She's a senior research resident scholar at AGSI. Her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the GCC. Her analysis of Gulf affairs has appeared in many publications, among them Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, and the Washington Post. And with that, Kristin, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Raymond, so much. And thank you for all of you who are with us today to join us to discuss this new book. I think all of us have been really floored kind of looking at the dramatic changes that have happened in Saudi Arabia over the last decade. I think now we're getting a bit used to them, the changes as they start to become more institutionalized. And I think one of the things that really stands out most prominently is how much all of these changes are really founded upon, driven by, and to some degree created to capture this new youth constituency and driven by youth concerns. It's been a really dramatic generational change in the kingdom, both in its leadership and the orientation of its economy and in the public life as well. And I would say even the identity of Saudi Arabia these days gives a much more youthful feel. And I think all of us watch that, even people, not paying really close attention can see that. But what's less understood is how this actually works its way and is expressed through policy. I think we all need kind of better understanding of what the Saudi state really looks like today, how it sets its priorities, what those priorities look like, and how they're engaging young people, which is, of course, the chief constituency and future of the kingdom, to both participate in those programs and to be successful, because we know that to create those programs, they need youth engagement and they need to be identifying the real needs of people within the kingdom. And that's why I think it's quite exciting to have a book here today that we can really highlight that is edited by Mark Thompson and Neil Quilliam. It's called Saudi Youth Policies and Practices. I want to talk to the authors a bit about how this came about, but just to give you a preview about it, it really does look across all of these different areas of identity, of employment, of education, also thinking about issues of identity and women's participation and other forms of agency. So I really encourage you to look in the chat. We have that advertisement, which will give you a discount, which, yeah, is needed often on these academic books. But I really think this one is worth your read. So I thought I would start by asking Mark a bit. I think it's interesting to discuss how this book came about, because that says a lot, I think, about the kind of engagement that you got and the expertise that you were able to bring to the table and what you were trying to do with this book. So Mark, if you can just let us know a bit about that, that would be great.
Oh, salam alaikum. Thank you very much, Kristin. And obviously, firstly, thank you to Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington for inviting us again. We're very grateful to have this opportunity. I'd also like to take the chance now to just say thank you to all our chapter contributors, because I know quite a lot of them are listening today as well. Well, actually, going back to your question, this sort of started originally with Neil and I have been working together now for about 10 years. And this really started with our first publication, which was Policymaking in the GCC, which and from that, we were sort of discussing more and more the fact that there needed to be more sort of Saudi-specific publications and workshops. And this happened at the Gulf Research Meeting, which is held annually at Cambridge University. So our second workshop and publication, again at Cambridge, resulted in a book called Governance and Domestic Policy Making in Saudi Arabia. And obviously, youth issues are related to absolutely everything. And it sort of became more and more evident. And of course, I was still teaching, still a university at the university and dealing with young Saudis every day. So it became more evident that we sort of really needed to have something that talks more about Saudi youth concerns and aspirations and perceptions of what all of this meant to them, but also engage as many young Saudis as we possibly could. Obviously, we're very fortunate today to have Noreen with us, who contributed that excellent chapter on housing. So when we had the workshop, we tried to attract as many Saudi participants. Not all of them contributed to the book for various reasons. However, their voices can be heard throughout the book, and in particular in the introduction and the afterword, where although we're saying this as the editors, we're reflecting very much what was said over the two-day workshop. And, looking back, quite a long time ago, it was actually quite difficult for quite a long time to get Saudi participants to come to this type of thing and engage. But now, sort of certainly since the vision was launched in April 2016, it's been much easier. And I think not just in this book, but in really all the work that we're engaged in to do with Saudi youth, sort of getting that bottom-up input, getting the voices of young Saudis involved in all of this is very important. And I think something else that I know we stress in the book, but I think we should sort of stress now, right at the beginning of this webinar, is that, when we talk about Saudi youth, a bit like when we talk about Saudi women, it's not one isolated group, it's highly diverse, depending on different constituencies, whether they're regional, whether they're socioeconomic, whether they're educational. And we have to have have a much better understanding of the diversity of Saudi youth right across the kingdom.
Well, when you had this opportunity then to really sit down with a lot of people that are, young people that are engaged in Saudi policymaking themselves now, often working and engaging with the government, and you heard the viewpoints and had this chance to have, and I spend a lot of time, I've gone often, I'm pretty regular participant in the Gulf Research Meeting, so shout out to them, where you really do spend 2 full days in a workshop setting and you get to know people's viewpoints and ideas quite strongly. What came out of this most to you, Neil? I mean, what was surprising to you and what did you want to bring to the forefront in this book?
So I think, as Mark said, just winding back a little bit, I remember when I was doing my PhD back in Durham, we were very excited because on one occasion we had 2 or 3 Saudi scholars, come from the kingdom, come to give a talk. And it was quite difficult at the time to engage with Saudi scholars. There were plenty of them, but access was always very, very different, and they tended to be, you know, of a many more senior in years than I was as a student. So there was this kind of gap. And then if you fast track to, you know, GRM in 2021 and subsequent years, the number of, you know, Saudi participants has really grown. It's very, you know, it's very clear. And I think, you know, what Mark and I initially wanted to do was sort of encourage young Saudi scholars to come and participate, particularly with our book. Now it's not a case of encouraging. I mean, it's, you know, it's there's self-encouragement. It just happens naturally anyway. So we've sort of seen, you know, we've seen that shift. What did we sort of take out of it, and what did we you know, what was surprising? I think scholarship on Saudi has it's not changed, that's not fair, but I think a Western understanding of Saudi Arabia is changing because you've got this younger generation of scholars that are coming through that are really engaging and bringing lots of different viewpoints. You know, I was rereading the book this morning just to, you know, refresh my memory. You know, and the word sort of, you know, monolith keeps coming out, and then diversity keeps coming out, and inclusion keeps coming out. And I think probably, you know, if you went back 20 years ago, our conception of Saudi Arabia was really quite simplistic and really clunky. That's not to say there wasn't great scholarship at the time, because there was, but you know, it was much more limited. So, you know, through GRM, through the book, as Mark calls it, you know, we've got these Saudi voices, Saudi perspectives that are coming through, and it's real, it's authentic. You've got, you know, different color. You've got from the different regions, a much more kind of nuanced understanding, I think, of what's going on, and almost a much more mundane, real understanding as well. You know, we're not just focusing on the big questions of succession or, you know, the big foreign policy decisions. It's actually kind of understanding how things are changing really kind of at the grassroots level, and the sort of the daily challenges that, you know, some of the youth are facing, or the great kind of, I guess, enthusiasm as well. Something I was thinking about, you know, just before I came online, and, you know, we think about the word kind of like, you know, participation. And I was thinking the final chapter in our book, actually, it's quite punchy. When I reread it, I thought, wow, that's, you know, there's some very strong statements in there, and it's great. But, you know, participation doesn't mean democracy in Saudi Arabia, but, you know, participation, say here in the UK, I went to vote, 40%, it was a 40% turnout. It was a relatively low vote, got a very, you know, large swing for Labour. But I think what we see at the moment in Saudi Arabia, and Mark and Noreen can talk more to that, is this very active participation.
Yeah.
Is this kind of buy-in to this big transition, this transformation that's taking place. And all I see is energy coming out of that. I'm sure it's not universal, but it's certainly, there's an energized youth that wants to shift the country. And I think that, for me, you know, and just looking at the book, that's what it is. There's that energy, that drive, but also very, very different experiences. You know, something I see and feel in London, of course, is because most of the people that I'm dealing with are, you know, on scholarships or are part of the elite. So for me, what we managed to get out in some of the chapters of the book was, you know, sentiment, was characterization of what it means to be Saudi, but, you know, but from the provinces.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good point to shift to Noreen then. Noreen, we can see you. You're joining us there from a co-working space, and give us a little image of the younger version of Saudi Arabia. Those of us who have been going to Saudi for a while and went and met people in their workplaces, which were completely gender segregated offices. In fact, it wasn't as easy to find Saudi women in those spaces. Yeah, the government offices didn't look quite as comfortable and relaxing and welcoming, I guess. Well, I guess it's welcoming, but in a different way as you have there. So tell me a bit. I know that Neil's kind of thrown out a lot of buzzwords about sort of diversity, inclusivity. But these things don't just happen, right? It takes like a lot of planning, and it takes policy, I guess I would say, to really start to engage and to try to figure how to get that diversity integrated into the policies that the state's actually trying to create. And of course, we know this is Saudi Arabia. Like all of the states, although they're diversifying, these are still, oil-driven states where the state sits quite heavily there. It's a very important actor. So I know your chapter is really concerned with this diversity and how you can draw in Saudis from across many different socioeconomic and regional perspectives into very critical policy, such as housing. Can you tell us just a bit from your own perspective, what you were hoping to contribute in your chapter and just in your broader participation in this project?
Thank you so much. Yeah, Neil said a lot of important things, and Mark as well, about how it's the transformation that's been happening is youth driven. So it's not really, I don't feel, at least from my perspective and my experience, that it's a question of should we include youth or what does youth think about this? It's almost like it's a given. It's driven by youth. They're contributing, they're participating, I'm participating. And I mean, 63% of the population is under 30, and the average age of Saudis is 25. So everything, all the policies and these economic reforms are designed for them majorly. And in the chapter that I wrote, it was about how to use behavioral insights to boost home ownership. So it's kind of like a very nice, let's say, case study to demonstrate, as Neil said, the mundane way of exactly how youth is contributing and taken into consideration when you're designing a policy. And the example here is, if we say like Vision 2030 level, there's the target of boosting home ownership to 70% by Vision 2030. And it was, when it was launched, it was at 47% in 2016. And then you go at the level of national transformation plans and you look at the housing program, which is basically, it offers the benefits and incentives to enable the demand in the housing market. And it's basically done through a platform, a digital platform called Sakani. And if you look at least in the chapter that I wrote, I was looking at, okay, so what are the different population segments? Because if we're talking about inclusivity and using behavioral science, you have to look at what your target audience is. And if we look at youth and we look at how they become eligible for a housing benefit, they have to be married first. So 66% of the population has never been married before, and that's a report that was back in 2020. So that's a very big segment of the population. Most of them are young. And now you think, okay, so what are the behavioral barriers that might be stopping them from fully utilizing the benefits that are at their fingertips offered by the government to drive, this transformation across the kingdom? So then you look at, okay, how is their behavior about marriage? They're delaying marriage because of the high cost of living, which includes housing. You look at, okay, how are their decisions about money? Only 19% of employed males are saving, only 7% of employed females are saving for housing. Yeah. So you look at all these behaviors and patterns, and then you start to, ask the question, okay, how do we introduce behavioral interventions so that we can nudge them to make the most out of these benefits? So I guess the most important message or takeaway from just this one case study is, when we start off with the question of, okay, how are we going to meet these targets? It's no longer a question of should we include youth or not. It's just part of it. By the byproduct is you design it for youth, and you design it for youth, and when the sense of youth in Saudi is not necessarily exceptional than the rest of the world. I mean, when you look at behavioral bias, it's quite universal. They're either present biased, or there's money illusion, or overconfidence in, saving up for the first down payment. So then again, it becomes super mundane, I guess, and not really that exceptional.
Yeah. It's just creating policy for younger generation.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm really curious because housing is it may not get a lot of attention in think tanks and stuff like this, but I know back when I was looking at things in Kuwait, for instance, and back even like 2011, we were having youth-driven demonstrations. There were surveys that were done, or what are the number one issues, and people were like, "Oh, we're talking about these big political things," and housing was consistently the number one issue, actually, that concerned people. The number one issue. So I'm just wondering how much success, I mean, how obviously this whole question of housing and your housing benefits coming once you're married is in a way sort of a barrier. Is there opportunity or openness to thinking about that differently? And how does it also work its way in cultural change? I mean, I know I've seen when I go to Riyadh now, I see a lot of young people that are coming from other cities. They're coming to Riyadh because a lot of the opportunities are in Riyadh, and they're living, in apartments on their own. How do you see policy responding to those social shifts that are happening?
Can you
Well,
please elaborate on the question? Because I don't think I understood it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I mean, can housing policy shift so that it can acknowledge that people might need some kinds of housing before they're married? And can it acknowledge, at least what I see on the ground, and I might be wrong on this, you can correct me, with a lot of young people moving, even young women, to live alone in the big urban centers, especially in Riyadh.
but they're not
Well,
living
to be,
alone, of them. No, they're sharing because they can't afford to live alone. So this is a big, because rents and things like this are increasing a lot. So and then internal migration to Riyadh is a big issue. So all of the certainly the young men I know who come to Riyadh are sharing. Yeah. Noreen, sorry.
yeah, no, it's okay. I was just going to say that I'm not sure. I can't really speak for where necessarily the trend of the policies is going to be inclusive of someone who's not married, or before they get married, they can be supported by the government in owning a home. Because what I can see is that the priority has been for newly formed Saudi families, or for instance, widows. They are also eligible for housing. But I am optimistic personally that probably maybe we would, in the future get housing benefits as single women and men.
Yeah, great. Let me go back to you for a moment then, Mark, because I wanted to know, again, this whole idea of sort of practice and the mundane things about how it happens on the ground. One of the main chapters there too has to do with employment, which obviously is another, if you think about the primary issues that are on the table there, it would probably be issues of employment, labor markets, and the whole transformation. We know that Saudi Arabia is quite interested in shifting towards more small and medium enterprises, perhaps, getting people to work a bit more in the private sector, and that needs to be driven by a more dynamic economy. We were talking and you were giving examples, I think, about all of the different sorts of major events that happen to try to engage people to discuss on these issues. Can you just give her a flavor of what that looks like, the policy in engaging with people in the state?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and really sort of to reiterate, what Neil and Noreen were saying, this is all very youth driven. I mean, there have been a lot of events sort of in this year that are targeted at youth in a way, because the issues and the topics that are very useful, things like LEAP, which of course was just before Ramadan, which is sort of billed as the largest tech fair in the world. Then you have Biban, which is by Monshaat, which is the SME one, which is in November this year. But I just went to their what they call their CEO forum 2 days ago, where it's looking at sort of how Monshaat can help startups, but also how they can help companies that are sort of further along in their journey. That's very interesting for me, because I actually bumped into quite a lot of my students who I taught a decade ago, who now have companies, and they were there. But then you've got these other events like 24 FinTech, which happened 4 weeks ago, which was the first FinTech fair in Saudi Arabia, held at Riyadh Front. the artificial intelligence one as well, which was a couple of weeks ago. And what's really interesting, and also I would have to say the Saudi heritage one as well, which is quite different, but celebrates, sort of Saudi heritage from right across the regions, and they bring in all of these craftspeople from all over the country. And what's really interesting about all of these is I go to them because the first thing I do when I go is I try to gauge the age of the audience. And you see that these are incredibly well attended. And the audience is primarily young. So like fintech, for example, I was, really surprised. I mean, it was sort of like, if the average age seemed to be about 20. And funnily enough, I was talking to one of my colleagues at MISC today, and she said to me that she'd been to fintech, and she said, gosh, she said it was so young. She felt the same thing. But it's not just that they're very young, but they're just so engaged. They're very passionate. They go for a reason. They go because they want to learn. They want to see what the other, when they all have areas where they have the startups, the Saudi startups. They want to see what everybody's doing. They want to see what everybody's involved in. So this sort of level of optimism, of wanting to engage, wanting to participate. And I think what's very interesting here is that and what you see in Saudi Arabia that maybe you don't see in many places at the moment, is that this idea amongst young people of personal development is tied to the idea of national development, tied to the vision. They are invested in the vision because they see that it's actually benefiting their lives. You only have to go. LinkedIn is not something that's used in a lot of countries very much. In Saudi Arabia, it's huge. You only have to go and look at LinkedIn every day and see all the things that these young Saudis are posting about the different courses they're taking and about different events they're going to. I mean, and it's widespread, and it's very, it is engaging, and it is exciting as well, I have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have in the book several chapters that deal with these identity issues that link to try to kind of connect those two together. I don't know, Noreen, if you can talk on this a bit too, just from your experience. That point that Mark just made about how the change is sort of like a personal project now for Saudis. Trying to think, we have like chapters by Anna Weiden on the new Saudi nationalism. So the way the state's been redefined to allow for that. And the way that culture also, I think Carolyn Montague has talked about how culture is also used as a tool. Can you talk just a bit from your personal perception too about how that cultural change is helping Saudi engagement?
Okay, let me make sure I understood your question correctly. So you want to understand my perspective on my personal experience and perspective about Saudi's change and transformation and many aspects, and one of which is the cultural shifts, right?
Right.
Okay. So basically, honestly, and this is not me even speaking academically, just my personal experience, I feel like ever since I was young, Saudi was either, or Riyadh specifically, because I live and grew up in Riyadh, was either just like 2 steps or a few steps behind me, or now with me, and now way ahead of me, and I can't keep up anymore. This is how I see it. I look at my sister who's now 10 years younger than I, and I just think I wish I had all these opportunities, and wow, where is she going to go? I look at my younger cousin who's 17 years younger, and I just think she's going to graduate around Vision 2030 year, or the year of 2030. And I can't even fathom or imagine what sort of life she'd be living in. And I can't have the audacity to even try, because already everything that's been happening so far has far exceeded my expectations. Even when I was a dreamer and thinking, no, of course, Saudi is going, I would envision my future. I already knew I would be driving, I already knew that I would be achieving so much, but in fact, it's way surpassed my expectations. And I definitely do feel privileged and lucky to be able to have something to offer, to contribute to driving this vision forward, to drive all these national transformation plans forward. And I can see it even at the, even at the level of, for instance, volunteering, like there's so many more volunteers, and at every event, at every sector that I see, everywhere I go, even during COVID, there were so many volunteers. So it could show you as well how youth is really voluntarily participating in this, and in their sense of new community. I think maybe that's something that's new to the Saudi nationalist identity. I feel like because of so many reasons, and one of which is probably heritage as well, and like us being more in touch with our diverse cultures, we are having a stronger sense of community as a whole society. And I think that's been helping, at least from my personal perspective.
Kristin, could I just come in on a point there?
Sure.
Thank you. I think the pace of change that Noreen was talking about is very real and very palpable. So I work with Saudi research media group Think, and what struck, I mean, I've been with them for a couple of years now. What struck me is that sort of everything has become so, to use that word, mundane, normalized so quickly. What, you were commenting previously on how, when one visited the kingdom to have meetings, and you would have had a different experience than me as a woman and a man. Now everything has just become so normalized. It's just, and I mean, for me, it still feels a little shocking to see it, but all my Saudi counterparts and colleagues, it's just like, yeah, okay, get over it. This is how it is now. Why are you behind with your thinking? It's just shifting. It's just moving. It's quite astonishing. It's just like, well, yeah, we're bagging this when we've got this one. We're moving on to the next.
But if I may, I think what's also very important is to understand that, these transformations are perceived differently in different regions, amongst different communities, different constituencies. It's not one size, as we say in the book, it's not sort of one size fits all. It's not all homogenous. It's uneven, if you want to say that, but it certainly is happening throughout the kingdom. But different constituencies interpret it sort of differently. So I mean, for example, I think like when I was in Tabuk last year, for when my Saudi friend said, "Oh, I don't know if you'd be interested, but do you want to go to the Tabuk Family Festival this evening?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely." To go and see, okay, so what's remained the same, but what has transformed here, for example. And I think and I think it's about having an understanding also about what people are comfortable with, and how they think, okay, in Taif, this is how we sort of interpret it, or Jizan or Abu Arish or Qasim. I think we have to be very careful not to just think that it's sort of standardized across the kingdom, because it isn't, because Saudi Arabia, of course, is a huge country, very diverse. Is it happening everywhere? Yes, to degrees, of course it is. But the priorities manifest themselves differently, I think, depending on where you are, and depending on your sort of socioeconomic status, etc. So going back to what you were saying about employment, Kristin, and the nuts and bolts. I mean, yes. I mean, employment remains the number one issue. But for example, if you are a female university graduate just about to graduate in Hyle, for example, your priorities are probably going to be very different from, say, a male graduate just about to graduate from King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. So I think we have to have an understanding of, yes, this is all important, but how are the priorities different in different regions and for different constituencies?
I'd like to take that up in a more concrete sense. But before I do, I want to remind all of our audience, and especially if we have some of the participants in the book, please do put your questions in the Q&A. We're getting well along. I'd love to turn to some of your questions. So if you have more specific questions about Saudi employment markets, education, culture kind of as a tool of change, any of these issues or anything that's just been sparked by the conversation, please do put them in the Q&A. We welcome those. Mark, can you give some examples from the book where it's sort of illustrated either the challenge of making that connection to Saudis coming from this diversity, let's say the regional diversification, just to start, or how that's translated into policy?
In terms of employment?
Or anything, I mean, kind of, did you come up with any concrete examples, either from the GRM or from the book, where that really became an issue that was, you know,
I mean, I think, you know, okay, so to go to employment, I mean, one of the issues that I think is talked about in the book, but I've also talked about it in lots of other forums, and you actually touched on it just earlier on, is the, at times, necessity to move to Riyadh, because, as you said, Kristin, you know, the majority of the opportunities are here. Now, I was in Al Mithna bin Qasim for Saudi National Day for this just last couple of weeks ago, and in the Istilaha there with a group of sort of young males who were all saying to me how some of them already work in Riyadh, but they were all saying they don't want to work in Riyadh. They don't want to live in Riyadh. You know, they want to live in their hometown. So this raises this issue of, you know, where you have internal migration happening to specific, I mean, mainly Riyadh, of course, to a certain degree to the other main cities, but Riyadh is the focal point these days. But this raises the issue of, you know, what happens when you have groups of young people who start to feel they are obliged to move to Riyadh when they don't actually want to, and what therefore, you know, what are the policies that you need to start implementing to make sure that the employment opportunities are available in, you know, the regional cities and towns as well. There is awareness of this, and of course this type of thing is happening. You know, you have places like Sudair Industrial City now, where a lot of people are locating to. There's a lot more jobs there. But I think, you know, we have to understand that yes, Riyadh is, you know, it's cool to move to Riyadh in a way, but as I said earlier on, you move to Riyadh and then you have to share with a group of people because you can't actually afford to live alone. And also, from the sort of the sociocultural side, you know, the fact that you therefore sort of can become disconnected from your families in wherever you're from, or you start to feel that you're not, you know, as a young Saudi, maybe, especially as a young Saudi man, maybe that you're not fulfilling some of your family obligations. And these are things I've heard so many times. So, you know, and I think maybe in a way that's one of the reasons why the figure for the numbers of people who plan to live in Riyadh was reduced sort of several months ago. But I think, you know, you can't have everybody in Riyadh. It's impossible. But you also need to, you know, you have these young populations in the regions, in regional cities and towns. You know, you need to make sure that you are also providing viable, not just employment opportunities, but career paths in those places.
Neil, you had said that in your own experience and everything, one of the things that you're really struck by is this whole question of participation and what that looks like. I think you commented on that a little bit earlier, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to think about that more broadly too, and also what you were able to bring about through the participation in this workshop and some of the fine articles that made it into the book, what they tell us then about how participation is changing, or how we should be thinking about participation in Saudi Arabia, maybe some of the challenges of that too.
Sure. I mean, I think it speaks to the point that was made earlier, and that's I think you know, Noreen said it, is that, you know, the youth by default are participating, are very much kind of, you know, in the driving seat of what's going on. I mean, from my own practical experience, I mean, I'm sure Noreen and Mark see this, but I mean, I work with a team of Saudis who are, I don't know what their average age is, but I suspect it's quite a lot under 30, who all have participation, who all have agency. You know, the projects we work on, I mean, they drive them. And what's striking to me is that quite often, you know, as a young graduate here, you know, you would land in your place and you would fulfill your tasks, and you might wait to be asked, you know, what are you going to do next? These guys, I mean, men and women are just driving ahead. So there's almost like an entitlement in a positive way, that, we're going to drive this. This is what we're doing. We want to take this here. What are we doing next? And how are we going to achieve that? So I see it very much sort of in that workspace, and that's where the tie between the individual and the national project comes together. It doesn't manifest itself, and the final chapter in the book on sustainable development goals talks about it. It doesn't manifest itself in any meaningful political sense, but I don't think that's an area at the moment, at least, that's desired. I think it's the change or the drive is very much kind of at the sort of, I guess, the business end of things, and that's that's employment, that's the housing issues, that's that's career, a desire to advance quickly. The other components may come at a later stage, but I don't think that that whether that appetite exists or not, it doesn't manifest itself, and that I think that will be an area that would become a little more difficult, a little more problematic, or a little more challenging. But I would say at the moment, at this particular conjuncture, everyone seems focused on it's almost like the Wizard of Oz, going down the yellow brick road and coming to coming to that end point, and just really driving forward. It's, I mean, for me, that's where the level of participation sits.
Can I just follow up with that, because, and then I'll come to you, Mark, in just a second, but I wanted to ask Neil a little differently. I mean, I think there is sort of something that's almost become a stereotype, because we do hear it from people's experience working with a lot of, not just in Saudi Arabia, but across the Gulf ministries and the like, that there's at kind of lower levels a real risk aversion, right? Because people don't want to kind of stick their necks out in a way. From what you're describing, that sounds different. I mean, do you see more appetite for risk, at least within the policy settings that you see within government agencies and the like?
Yes, I mean, I'd say it's uneven. I mean, I think, again, if you wound back 20 years ago, appetite for risk was pretty much zero. Everything would be pushed up and up and up and up, and decisions would take forever to be made. I think there's still a little hesitancy in some areas, but in other areas, this is why I say it's uneven. In other areas, that risk appetite is really quite large, and decision making is, in some areas, less hierarchical than it would have been before. The steps for approval are minimized. Some of that is, Mark and I have written in another book, some of that is sort of the way in which bureaucracies are being changed, or new institutions are being created alongside the age-old bureaucracies. So a lot of the processes can be, cut through. Bureaucracy and process. So for example, in the human resources department would be no different to probably how it was 10 years ago, would be no different to how it would be in a HR department, in a Western institution. Very, very, very slow and methodical. Other places or other spaces where a product or a project has to be delivered, decisions are made, and risk appetite is very clear. We've got to go ahead. We've got to get this done. Let's just push through everything. So it's a bit mixed.
Yeah.
I guess sort of in some it's mixed, and that's to be expected anywhere where some shift or change or organizational development is taking place.
Yeah. Mark, I know you wanted to come in on that, and I thought I'd just go ahead and fold in. We had a statement and a question from an anonymous attendee, which I think Neil has just answered much of it. So many young people are excited and looking for opportunities, but how much do they want a socio-political dialogue, and are they getting it? How can you educate people 2 or 3 degrees and then give them no say in the political direction of the country? So I don't know, Mark, if you want to address that. I think it's something that we hear quite often. Is there more shape? And we know that in some of the initial stages, especially the early days when we had a government transition in Saudi Arabia under the new government. I mean, I'm willing to say it right here. There were obviously plenty of arrests, and some people were quite unnerved by the changes. Do you see that there's more space now for, on some levels, for socio-political dialogue? And how do you answer this question about the agency in shaping political direction?
Well, first of all, I think, we have to understand that we're talking about Saudi Arabia, so we have to understand the Saudi context and how Saudis understand this, not how it's understood by people outside Saudi Arabia. This is very important. There are things that are definitely happening. So I can give you an example. So for example, in December 2023, MISC had their youth assembly. Quite interesting that the word assembly was used. They had their youth assembly where they actually, young people from across Saudi Arabia applied to join this. It went over for sort of 2 days. And what had to happen at this particular thing, I was there as a sort of advisor to one particular group who were looking at a national identity. And what these young people actually had to do was come up with, think about some problems, then think about some possible solutions to those problems, and then how they would, and then make policy recommendations on this, which would then forwarded to the various ministries who are involved. Now, and this was MISC, and this type of thing was happening in MISC. So this is, and we, as there were, it was male and female from all regions of the kingdom. So, this quite clearly is, participating in that type of issue. I mean, the group I was with, for example, they came up with a fascinating topic, which actually won the prize, but they were sort of basically saying, those who had been to university were sort of saying, why is it that we can talk about our majors in English, but we can't talk about them in Arabic? So which is very, very interesting. So so I think yes, it does happen on different sort of levels. Another example is which I'm involved with at the moment, is the Salam for Cultural Communication Youth Leadership Program, which just kicked off this week. And I'm actually giving a lecture next week, more of a seminar discussion next week, where, funnily enough, there's 70 of them. There's a very rigorous application process. I think there's something like 6,000 applications and they take 70, and they go through this whole process over 3 months where they have talks from people from all the different ministries and governments and non-profit organizations, and they engage with them. And so, this is another, and these young people are actually all in full-time employment. This is another example where this is actually happening. They're having all of these face-to-face meetings with all of these different people. So yes, I mean, to sort of reiterate what Neil said, certainly at times it's uneven, but I think that's normal given where we are in the transition, and we're dealing with people, and people, it's anything that where you're dealing with people is always going to be uneven. But you see, you certainly see these things happening, but you don't, from my personal experience over dealing with young people in multiple institutions, you don't see, they want to engage in ways that are compatible to how they feel and from their backgrounds. And I think that's very important, this issue of compatibility.
Kristin, can I just come in on a little point here, because it's obviously quite a sensitive subject.
Yeah.
Just on one area. I mean, something that strikes me is, it's a very good question, and it's a question that I think about. But I think, and we can't talk for everybody because it's big and diverse, but there is a very strong sense of like nationalism and new nationalism, I guess, if you characterize it as that. And quite often when I'm writing and I'm working with colleagues, my Saudi colleagues will look at my language and deconstruct my language and say, why are you characterizing it like this? And that becomes political pushback. And I look at my language, and they're pointing at the imperialism or the Western orientation in my language, or the assumptions. So there is this kind of bristling nationalism and political pushback, but there's, I'd say at the moment in this stage of development, it's very, very much positively oriented towards the way, you know, the country is going. But the political manifestation comes out when, you know, when you're perceived to misunderstand or misinterpret or bring a language that is, you know, is not perceived to be at least at the very least neutral. So it exists, but not in the way, you know, an outsider might see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think there's a lot to understand in that, and the comprehensive aspects of Saudi change. And I think the attention that's been given to the overarching kind of frame that change is taking place in, which is the nationalism and sort of national pride, and the way that you can participate in building this new Saudi Arabia has a lot to do with the way that participation is brought along, and expectations are set kind of for what you can do. I wanted to turn to Noreen and see just if any of this resonated with you, or if you had something you wanted to add yourself about that. Obviously, to your young Saudi, very well educated. I mean, you're contributing a very interesting chapter that has to do with really bringing behavioral sciences into understanding these things. I'm just wondering about how you sort of perceive your role in Saudi Arabia, but I also just want to more broadly, if you know, your role in this new thing in your space where you can bring your expertise, but also just if there's anything you heard that you wanted to react to, and I welcome that.
No, I mean, both Neil and Mark honestly phrased it super well, especially by giving specific examples from their experiences and the initiatives that have been going on, which is the main thing, is that it's even our definition and our understanding of participation and what is political for us and not political is very, very context-based, to the point that, you know, even when Mark was saying that in MISC they used the word assembly, I couldn't understand why that's a word that is important. That what does it mean, you know? Because for us, these terminologies are irrelevant, and we have our own, let's say, glossary or like dictionary of what is political and what isn't. And then the example that Neil gave, which is what becomes a little bit political, especially given the current context regionally, which is what is our understanding of transformation? What is our understanding of and standard of where we want to go, rather than necessarily like Western understanding of where they think we should be, or they define as, you know, good or bad. And I think that most of us are just incredibly preoccupied with just moving forward and achieving the goals and of the vision. And specifically in Saudi and in the Gulf in general, we're just honestly lucky and blessed and privileged because of security. Like we just have security, thankfully. But I mean, this I think expands across the Arab world. We have our own definition and our own context, and that's how we want to move forward, and that's how it makes sense for us.
So you see the goals is defined by the vision. The vision is pretty clear on kind of what the priorities are. And you see a lot of space there for you to work towards something that you can support.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even just that I see space. It's almost that I'm actively being engaged and encouraged to be engaged and participate. And again, I'm just one person of millions in Saudi. So I understand that also I am lucky and I am privileged. And my understanding of, you know, what is moving forward might be different than other Saudi women's understanding of, you know, them liking this certain change or not. But change is happening. We're all participating. And I do see diversity, at least even in the change, because sometimes I see change that maybe I'm not really necessarily interested in, or I'm neutral towards, but it is change and it is driven by someone who has a different perspective. And as I said, even with the policy making process, we are properly engaged to a level that at least I'm satisfied with.
Yeah, and I guess the diversification whole program too, where you've created a lot of new fields within the economy that are now open to Saudis to participate in. Like you said, you might see change you're not interested in, but people might find areas in sport or in the arts or something that are now newly open to participate in. We have a question, Neil. I think you're very sorry, Mark, you're very well set to answer because I know how much you travel around the kingdom. You also have your hand up, so I want to let you respond because I think there might be an immediate thing you want to respond to, but I'm also going to give you this question. Do you consider that these changes, and you've addressed this a little bit, but I'll just give you the full question from an anonymous attendee. Do you consider these changes are equally welcomed in most areas? Do traditional areas such as the Najd welcome the speed of change and the type of change? How are traditional areas looking after their inherited forms of Islam and what is happening to Islamic practice? I'm happy to speak to that a bit too, but are you interested to respond to that?
Sure. I think, I'm working on a book, I think a follow-up book to Being Young Male in Saudi at the moment, also for Cambridge University Press. Two of my main themes are what's not changed, and also the fact that we overuse the word or the term change when in fact it's not change, it's adaptation. And that's different, and I think we have to have an understanding of this because the core identity narratives of Islam and family are as important today as they ever were, and that gives the foundation, if you like, the security for a lot of these other things to be happening. Now, more traditional areas, if you want to call them that, yes, of course, when you go to the regions, when you go to Qasim, certain places in Najd, for example, or the south, away from Jizan city, or places like, Aflaj and whatever, then this goes back to what I said before. Priorities are different because realities of life in these areas are different. And I think it's, that's why I said that you can't sort of accept this sort of standardized sort of idea of this sort of happening in all of the same way right across the kingdom, because it's not. To reiterate what Noreen just said there, is everybody happy with everything? No, of course not, because they're human. Is everything important to everybody? No. If you go to Sakaka, for example, people are not particularly interested in Western music concerts that are happening in Riyadh because they know only the 1% really go to those anyway. So different constituencies have their different priorities and they have their different concerns. And I think, this is why I travel around the kingdom so much, because you have to have an understanding of what really matters there. But yes, the importance of Islam in everyday life, I don't see that as having changed at all. I see it as pretty constant. The numbers, you look at the numbers of Saudis who went on Umrah in the last 10 days of Ramadan, for example. Look at the numbers of Saudis, who were on Hajj this year. I was on Hajj with young people, young Saudis, also some other young people from the Arab world. This is a constant, I think. And I don't see that as particular changing. I see adaptation happening. Mm-hmm. But I think, again, it's very important to understand what the priorities are in the different regions, because otherwise there's a danger that you exclude people because they're not part of of what's going on in Riyadh, and that obviously is dangerous. But then saying that again, when I'm often asked about Riyadh, what's happening in Riyadh, and my response is immediately and always, which Riyadh? Mm-hmm. Which Riyadh are you talking about? Because there are very, what people would term traditional parts of Riyadh, which are very different. People in those parts of Riyadh would not probably dream of going to Bujeri Terrace or somewhere like that at the moment. So it is, it's even within the urban settings, you get a lot of diversity and a lot of different priorities about this. But I think overall, when I look at Saudi Arabia today compared to the Saudi Arabia that I first arrived in, I definitely see that Saudi Arabia is a much happier place. a much more relaxed place. There is these regional variations exist, and these urban variations exist, and we need to be very. It's very important that we recognize that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we know that the political understanding, I think, of Islam, or the role of Islam on a political level, has shifted. That doesn't mean that Islam is not still part of the calculation, but there's definitely, we can see at the upper level that there's been a real reinterrogation, I guess, of where the kingdom had been previously, and some forms of Islam that had been actually championed have now been definitely more discouraged, and there's a reinterpretation taking place on the national level, right? And I think that people adapt to that. And obviously, maybe, as Mark said, there's a lot of different variety too, though, and how people respond to that. It is very interesting. We can have a whole nother thing. I don't want to take it in this book about how that adaptation to Islam and how the state manages that. I wanted to mention, though, I know that we've had these questions that you just responded to, Mark, about changes in how this is perceived in different parts of Saudi Arabia, about the nationalism. There are chapters, a really excellent chapter by Anna Weiden, looking at the role of this new Saudi nationalism, which I think we've all been addressing here. Rima Al-Harbi has a really great chapter on narratives of change in rural Saudi Arabia. So there are opportunities to get more deeper into that and really, more of almost like a case study, look about that, how that adaptation actually takes place. So I definitely urge all of you to look to the book, and you can get into many more details about some of these topics. One thing that we talked about previously is to talk about, and I think this really came up in what Noreen was saying about how the vision has really changed the way that people work. And a lot of these things is about work and transformation. We know this is at heart kind of an economic diversification plan. Could each of you just give kind of an example, either from your personal life or from something in the book that you saw, that explains kind of how this shift has happened and how people are working in Saudi Arabia today? And Noreen, you're in a co-working space. Maybe you can address that to start.
Okay, wait, again, so to just understand your question, how has our experience of just work changed as well as parts of the economic diversification that's been going on?
Yeah, I mean, how does it kind of look like on the ground work, particularly how the vision sort of defines that, and just what it feels like in terms of practice, everyday practice too.
Yeah.
Well, to start off, when I first started working when I was in college, around 19 years old, and I remember that at the start I was feeling timid entering a workspace that is not gender segregated, and there was some gender segregation in the workspace that I was working at, and I was still unsure about the norms, the gender norms of what is acceptable, what is appropriate. I have not seen it happen in front of me because the women that I saw working were either in the healthcare sector or in the education sector, and in the education sector it was also gender segregated. So that was my introduction to the workspace. Fast forward now, as you know, both Neil and Mark were saying, everything is just normalized, and you just go about your business, and there's no more, at least for me, there's no more that timid sense of, okay, how am I being misunderstood by the opposite gender, how to interact with the opposite gender. I think that's definitely something that has changed. And then another aspect that, since I started working until now, or at least since I actually graduated until now, that has been salient in my mind, and is, I think there's a lot of focus on it in the academic literature, which is nationalization policies, Saudization policies, and more specifically, the gender quotas that were there. I think, I'm not sure if they're still there, but there was at a time where, you know, the government was incentivizing companies to in the private sector to hire a Saudi female, so that you get like kind of 2 points in the Nitaqat program. and that bumps you up and gives you more privileges as a company to, for instance, hire non-Saudis. And I remember the general conversations, let's say, around these gender quotas, and whether women were taking jobs for men or not, and just I think even going to job interviews, knowing that this is something that the government is supporting this company in hiring me, not just by putting these gender quotas, but also by paying a portion of my salary and sometimes up to 50% with the company just for them to hire me. So I think, you know, Nitaqat is not necessarily part of Vision 2030 programs, but I think it's definitely, let's say, been more active because there are more sectors. For instance, now the consulting sector or industry, it has, I think last year started to be Saudized 35%, and now it's going into effect 40%. And the consulting industry is basically kind of like the right arm of the operational aspect of Vision 2030. You know, consulting companies all over the kingdom are working with governmental sectors to implement all these national transformation programs and to even design them at a strategic level. So to see that there's a quota for Saudis to be involved so that there's more sustainable growth, it shows that there is an investment in our development, not just reducing unemployment rates for now, you know?
Yeah. And I think the whole introduction, and Mark, maybe you can speak to that, of that kind of consultancy arm that's part and kind of working part and parcel, parallel with or with the government, is part of that kind of transformation in the workplace, even like a cultural transformation, perhaps in terms of expectations and yeah, even the way it kind of looks as work.
But going back to your question about employment, and I mean, without a doubt, you know, how attitudes to employment have changed is enormous, and the employment opportunities now are enormous as well in comparison to how they were even 10 years ago. And to give you an example, so I'm involved in a project at the moment called Human Capital Development in the logistics and transportation sector, which I'm working with the Saudi Logistics Academy here in Riyadh. The Saudi Logistics Academy opened in 2021, and they've subsequently, since 2021, opened branches in Jeddah and Dammam, and they've got plans for other ones to be open in other parts of the kingdom, because they are inundated with people wanting to take their courses, wanting to do their internships and what have you. And of course, a lot of this in the logistics sector, which is, you know, provides an enormous amount of jobs in Saudi Arabia at the moment, around 6%, when I think the plan is for it to increase to 10% by 2030. You know, and a lot of these jobs as well are not jobs for people who are coming out of tertiary education. You know, there are jobs for people who are coming out of high school, people who want flexi working, part-time working, housewives, whatever. But the demand is enormous. And this shows you, you know, the growth in these different types of areas, which I think is very, very important. And the desire and we, you know, for this project, we actually did 3 separate workshops, one for the government stakeholders, one for the private sector stakeholders, and another one for job seekers, trainees and employees. And it was just so interesting to see these young, both male and female, of course, to see how they saw a career in logistics, not just a job, but a career. And I, you know, because this is something that's really quite new. So this is, you know, and by the way, we are actually presenting the executive summary of this at the Global Logistics Forum, which is at the end of October in Riyadh. And hopefully we'll be publishing this and make it available to everybody by the end of the year. It's about a 30,000 word report.
Big report. We'll look forward to that. Neil, I want to allow you, if you want to speak to that idea of transformation of work, what that looks like in practice. But we also have a question, so if I can fold that in too for you. I think you're pretty well set, because I think you work across the Gulf. This obviously goes beyond the book, but Mr. Nizar Hilal, who's a candidate at the Gulf Study Center in Qatar University, is wondering about how the changes and adaptation of new policies targeting Saudi young people have a direct influence on other youngsters of the same age, jobs, status, statutes, inspirations, interests across the Gulf region. So this is a question about if the changes in Saudi Arabia are, if we see those in other Gulf states as well, impacting those.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take the two things. Sort of anecdotally on the work front, I would use the idiom from coasting to consultancy. I spent a bit of time in King Abdulaziz University immediately after I got my PhD. I think at the time I was the only Western scholar in the university, and the pace of, let's put it this way, the pace of life was very slow, and I found it quite difficult to adapt to that very, very slow pace of life. And at the time, you know, I graduated with a bunch of Saudi friends, and they returned to the kingdom, and you know, they were able to kind of coast along, really. You know, they got their PhDs outside, they came back into nice positions and didn't really have to sweat or exert themselves. So that was my sort of original experience. Now working, you know, for a Saudi organization, I mean, it's, you know, it's private sector. It's very, very different. Yeah. It's, you know, it's very fast, very fast paced, very much, you know, kind of performance driven, evidence-based everything. You have to produce evidence for absolutely everything, you know, you're producing. So just the shift has been, you know, significant. It's really quite something. So to me, that's my observation. You know, it's not just talking about change or transformation. I mean, the workplace is really different. You have to deliver. If you don't deliver, then you're out, basically. I mean, it's almost too much. It's almost too fast. I think they have to find the right balance, but at the moment everything's in overdrive. But that's a positive development. In terms of you know, the Saudi experience sort of washing over onto the Gulf, I'm sure that's going to happen. I mean, you could argue that, you know, some of the other Gulf states were making these shifts and making these changes ahead. So, you know, some of those changes were already sort of in play. But I think with everything happening in Saudi and, you know, the sheer size and pace of the change and the opportunities it's presenting, I think it's also drawing in a lot of people from the Gulf as well. So there's, you know, there's this strong centripetal pull at the moment, and people are looking at that very positively. But there's an interesting political dimension to this, because, you know, when I'm sure it's the same for you guys as well. But when I speak to sort of you know, Saudi officials at MOFA, they'll quite often say, well, you know, Iran doesn't necessarily do very positive things in the region, right? I mean, you know, it presents this destructive model. Now Saudi Arabia's on this course. You can imagine a lot of the young Iranians, and it's got an equally young population, are looking across thinking, you know, do we really want what we've got here? Is that not the model we want, where we see opportunity, we see, you know, positivity? So I think Saudi, to a large extent, will be a model that may be inspiring, you know, young Iranians, definitely young Gulfers, but young Iranians. Though, you know, knowing Iran a little bit and knowing Iranians a little bit, they, you know, their own sense of pride and nationalism might not allow them to admit that. But I think those changes will be very, you know, very, very attractive, probably right across the region, to be honest.
And if I might come in there, I mean, it wasn't that long ago where we all used to talk about Riyadh being the world's most boring city, you know, and everybody used to go to Bahrain and Qatar and what have you, in Dubai. Well, now, of course, everybody's laughing because everybody from Dubai, Qatar and Bahrain are coming here. You know, Riyadh has become a tourist destination. Saudi Arabia is becoming a tourist destination because of all the different things that are going on, all the entertainment and the museums and what have you. So you can, when you walk around Riyadh, I mean, you see Omanis everywhere, you see Qataris everywhere, you see Kuwaitis everywhere, a lot of them coming here to study as well. So it's clearly having an impact on young people in other Gulf countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly the whole Saudi transformation is really posited on the fact that it can be something attractive that will engage not only Saudis, but bring other people from outside. So I guess the success of the project is really going to have to be on if they can sustain that kind of change. Noreen, if I can ask you, we have another question, maybe you're best set to answer. We kind of touched on it quite a bit, but I'll throw it out there. This is from Abdulaziz Khattak. Do you think national identity will get stronger after the ongoing economic and cultural liberalization policies? Also, the sense that the youth have more opportunities to express individuality while still embracing traditional values. Does that resonate with you, or you can reframe it if you see it a different way?
Yeah, I think we did touch upon it. I think that for me, I can't really speak for just how national identities are formed or all of these things because I'm just not really an expert on that. But my experience is, I think that, again, the more that we're having a sense of community as a society, and the more that we're participating and encouraged to participate, and you know, just you feel, whenever it's like a plant, you know, where you feel that you're on fertile soil, you're being nurtured, you're happy, and you obviously will be more invested as well in your own environment. So I think it's on that level, it's quite simple. I don't think it's how can I say? I don't think it's as sensitive or politicized as at least in my mind. So yeah, that's how I can relate to it.
I think the individual identity point is very important, because you do see how individual identities become more defined within the collective, if you like. You know, so a certain person is not just a member of this family or this tribe or whatever, but this person is also known because he's got a successful startup, or she's a famous become a famous photographer, or what have you. So you see the development of the individual expression, if you like, within the collective, which I think is very interesting.
Well, we're
especially through LinkedIn and social media.
Yes, exactly. Yes, Snapchat, all of these things, definitely. Yes, it's something that's very important now. Yeah. And a lot to do with heritage and the arts and all of that. You know, very, very important. Poetry, writing, filmmaking, in all of these areas.
Yeah, we work a lot with that at the Institute. We're working a lot in the creative fields now, and in the arts. And of course, we get a lot of dynamism out of Saudi Arabia now, and get to interview a lot of young Saudi artists, which is fantastic. I will mention there's a chapter too. You mentioned kind of online and how you get expression. Ghaida Abdullah Joaisa has a nice chapter on Saudi women's identities and how their online practices across different social media platforms. So again, that's another theme that I think comes through a lot in Saudi Arabia. We know that a lot of these changes that came in the kingdom were initially voiced and practiced, I guess we could say, online through social media, especially when there was not much opportunity to do so IRL, I guess you would say, in real life. So it's interesting to see and to have scholars kind of looking at how those practices are shaped too and are still ongoing. I
found that chapter really, really, really interesting.
Yes.
I reread it again today, and I just think the way, you know, the author just sort of details how the identities are. You know, we would assume, or the working assumption would be, online and offline identities are really quite distinct, and you know, you can live another life, whereas they're so intimately twined, and it's much more complex and diverse than that. And I thought how she represented, you know, some of the different you know, characters that she had interviewed was really, really interesting.
Excellent.
Again, I invite you to get in deeper into the book. I'm trying to see. I don't think we have any more sort of new questions. Oh, wait, there is one. There we go. One more for Neil, and then I want to give you a chance to talk about some of your exciting new things that are very related to this project. Neil, we have a question. I just moved. Do you think the new Saudi work ethic will fit? Oh, well, it's about Iranian history and the Bazaari economy and influence young Iranians. I guess you're going to get to speak about Iran now, since you brought it up.
So what's the question? Sorry.
The question, sorry. As the new Saudi work ethic, will it really fit into Iranian history of the Bazari economy and influence young Iranians? So maybe there's some skepticism coming from our.
No, I doubt it.
Okay. I think there's a lot of dynamism actually in Iran as well.
No, there's definitely
even in the Bazari economy, there's a lot of dynamism actually, let's be fair.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Absolutely.
Okay, sure. Let's move a bit to then. I want to be sure give you a chance, maybe before, because Neil brought up that chapter, if there's anything else in this book that hasn't been highlighted, that a particular chapter or something that took place in the discussions that you'd like to bring out, maybe we have a moment to do that. Noreen, I don't know if you were part of the initial conversations or if there's anything else in the book, or if you want to give a bit more detail about your own chapter, I would welcome that now.
I think that I've said most of the things that are, nice teasers for the audience to engage with the book further. And I think, again, this discussion has been super rich. I wasn't involved necessarily in the background or the start of things, but definitely was encouraged by both Mark and Neil to contribute to the book. And I'm happy that I did. And thank you for this conversation. It's been very enriching.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, before you look to what's coming in the future, is there anything else in this book that you wanted to kind of highlight or that we kind of missed out on discussing?
No, I think we've covered most of the things and referred to sort of most of the chapters, really just to reiterate my thanks to everybody who contributed to this book in different ways, including our publishers at Springer as well, who were wonderful.
Yeah, and remember, we do have right now in the chat, we have the discount. If you'd like to purchase the book, please take a look there. I know that you guys aren't finished, though, that you have another project that you're working on that really developed very much out of this project. Neil, do you want to give us a preview of where you're headed now and what we have to look forward to?
Actually, I'll let Mark answer that one, because he's sort of driving it. But if I could, I mean, I enjoyed all the chapters, but one that also jumps out is Caroline Montague's chapter.
Yes.
She's been back and forth to Saudi for quite a number of years. So,
yes,
she's
wonderful.
been very party to, to those changes. And I like the way, that she can draw on the past, and something, through, I think, our GRM workshop, Kristin, that was last year when you took part in that one of the messages that came through that, that workshop was, there is change, there is transition, but it didn't just start in 2015 or whatever,
Right.
It's been going on quite a long time. And I think Caroline is very good at just kind of picking that up. And she has I won't read them now, but she has some very choice phrasing in her chapter, and they just jump out at you, and they're just beautifully crafted sentences. So I would definitely recommend that. But linking sort of previous earlier times to the contemporary, and she does it very, very beautifully.
And I think we can say thank you to Caroline, because I believe she's with us today.
I was just going to say my thanks too. I think all of us can say thank you to Caroline. She's somebody that's been at work and really on the ground and engaging in Saudi Arabia for a very long time. And I know I personally have gained a lot from my conversations with her, and it's great that her perspective, her intellectual perspective, which she has a lot to draw upon, is included in this book. Neil, do you want to, sorry, Mark, do you want to tell us what your upcoming project that you're driving that grew out of this project is?
Yes. Well, there's an edited book that's coming out next year with Bloomsbury Ivory Taurus, which is called Realizing Saudi Vision 2030, Governance, Institutions and Human Capital Development. And Neil is providing a chapter on that, on energy. As Raymond said right at the beginning, Neil is an energy expert. Really what this is looking at is how the vision has changed the way that we work and we live, and how our daily lives have changed within the institutions we work in. So everybody who's involved in this chapter, Saudi and non-Saudi, have been working for Saudi institutions pre and post vision. So it's looking at all of these sort of developments from very much a Saudi perspective. We have tourism, obviously, we have defense, we have energy, we have logistics, We have sort of overviews about how sort of government has changed and what have you from people working in government institutions. So very excited about this. I'm just in the process at the moment of putting together the manuscript. So inshallah, this will be available next year. Going back to something that Noreen was talking about saving and, you know, or not saving. We also have a 20,000 word report coming out this year called Awareness of Financial Literacy Amongst Young Saudis, Establishing a Healthy Relationship with Money. Which is not just about financial literacy, but is also about saving and spending patterns amongst young Saudis. So what's driving this? And so, for example, one of the challenges we look at in this is the proliferation of buy now, pay later schemes in Saudi Arabia that have skyrocketed recently. And then I also have, on a personal level, I have a paper which will be published again, hopefully in the next coming months, which is called Reflections of Hajj 1445, Pilgrim and Volunteers Perspectives, because my research assistant was a volunteer at Hajj and I was obviously a pilgrim. So this is our sort of combination of what, you know, reflections on this. So all of these things, and there's a lot of other things, but all of these things are happening, which is exciting because there's so much that needs to be researched.
Right. Well, I think maybe we'll leave it there. Something everybody, please look to the book, buy the book, learn from it. Look to the new work that's coming, and thank to both of you. I know Neil and Mark, you guys are really have been consistently executing really great publications that give us a better eye on the kingdom. And look to Noreen and a lot of these scholars that are coming out of Saudi Arabia. We're trying to engage more and more. Definitely, well, they're telling us where the kingdom is going in many ways. So really, thank you all for joining, and again, buy the book, and look forward to some future events. We'll have another at AGSIW. We're going to have another talk coming up soon that's looking at women's voices, that has a lot of participation from a lot of scholars across the Gulf, I know, especially from Kuwait. So I hope you'll look to and join us in some of these future book talks. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. And thank you to the audience for engaging.